And welcome to the Parasha pod. I'm Mordechai Rosenberg here with Menachem Leibtag, and we are talking Torah together. This time we're talking about the HaGadol for Pesach.
Shabbat HaGadol this week as well, so it's good for this Shabbat, and good for Chag HaMatzot, and for Pesach, and for Shabbat Chol Hamoed.
Absolutely. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, it's time to learn. All right, Rabbis Liebtag, I think when it comes to the HaGadol, a lot of people have been through the HaGadol so many times. It's like a well-worn path. People have asked a lot of questions. They've given a lot of answers. Can you tell us, is it something that you think of that you think maybe people are missing, that we have been through this so many times and yet we've missed an important point?
I'll start with the song I think most people sing in the very beginning. Everyone knows the famous the Manishtana, which we call the four questions. And the answer to the Manishtana is Avadim Hayinu. We always usually sing that answer together. Remember, Avadim Hayinu Hayinu? And most people sing Ata Ata B'nei Chorin. We were once slaves, and now we are all free. Ata Ata B'nei Chorin. It's a famous song. Not everyone sings it that way, but that's pretty popular.
Right. I mean, it's not actually in the words, but it feels like we're kind of summarizing what comes next.
It's a holiday of freedom. In fact, in Shmoneh Esrei we say Zman Chirutenu.
Right.
Now, and therefore, a lot of people think that the theme of the Seder is about freedom, the importance of freedom, and that makes it quite universal. In fact, if you remember Martin Luther King, "Let my people go," the idea of the freedom of slavery, freedom for everyone being equal, that there's no doubt that's a universal theme that is important to the Torah for all humankind. The question is that the theme of our Seder? Because we don't say that in our Haggadah. We say Avadim Hayinu l'Pharaoh b'Mitzrayim, and that God took us out with outstretched hand, and then we continue to explain if God didn't take us out, we'd still be slaves, which is about gratitude. And then we move on to even if it's not only for children, it's for adults. But we really never say in our Seder that now we're free. In fact, if you look later on in your Seder, about a half hour later, we make an opening statement. Mitchila, way in the beginning, we were once idol worshippers. V'achshav kivanu makom la'avodato. God now brought us closer so that we can serve Him. In other words, we went from slavery to servitude. Slavery, beautifully in Hebrew, the word eved can mean a slave who's forced labor, has no choice. It can be a servant who's being paid, doing it to get reward. Or it can be an eved who loves his job, who, like Eliezer, Eved Abraham, I want to work for my boss. I identify with my job. What's called an Eved Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu was called Eved Hashem in the end of Chumash. Yeshua. No, it's someone who identifies with their job. He might get rewarded, but the goal of his work, his service, is the service itself and not the reward. And therefore, we were taken out of slavery to become servants of God. And that's an important point in the Seder. It's not only about freedom, it's freedom in order to be in the service of God. So you can't be in the service of God if you're working for someone else, if you're enslaved. But the purpose of our freedom is, I like to say, it's not freedom from, but freedom for. Not only freedom from slavery, but freedom for, to get to Torah at Har Sinai, to become God's nation.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what you're saying is that the reason that we don't actually say that line is because,
It's not the theme of our Seder.
Right. It's the idea of being B'nai Chorin, free people, is not actually what we are trying to emphasize, which is a pretty surprising claim. The idea that actually we go from servitude to Pharaoh to a different form of service. It's a better form of service, but we're not actually celebrating being free from service.
In fact, I like to call the chutzpah Dikkasan's question, where in our Seder we're gonna thank God for taking us out of Egypt and keeping His promise to our ancestors. God promised Abraham that He would take us out of slavery, but when you read carefully, He also promised to put us into slavery.
Right.
And after we make that statement, we once idol worshippers and God brought us closer to serve Him, we quoted a speech from Yeshua about the need to, how he enters a covenant with the people after we conquer the land. He begins with, we were once idol worshippers and God chose us. He goes through the whole story of the Exodus, and then they make an agreement to become God's people. Then we thank God. The next paragraph is Baruch Shomer Avtachato. We thank God for keeping His promise. We quote the covenant of the parts, Brit Ben Abtarim, where God promised Abraham Avinu, you should know that your children will be offspring in someone else's land. They're going to be enslaved and afflicted. It'll be for a long time, up to some 400 years. Ultimately, I'll punish your oppressor and take you out and give you the land of Israel to become sovereign there, help you conquer it and establish a nation. But to become God's nation, there's a need to go through this difficult process, which I like to refer to as basic training. So if we appreciate the need to go through slavery to become God's nation, then I can thank God for that. If it's only about gratitude, the Seder, that we were stuck in Egypt, we were put into slavery, and God came and saved us, and saying thank you, that's something that's some 4,000 years ago. What makes it meaningful today? But if God put us into Egypt to go through affliction and servitude, to train us to become God's people, to appreciate freedom, again, the universal goal of the Seder of Judaism is that all humans should be free. We're in the servitude of God to teach that message of freedom, that no nation should enslave another nation. Now, God, if you follow the rest of Chumash...
Hold on a second. So just let me make sure I'm following you right. So the question is here, what are we doing thanking God for taking us out of Egypt if He was the one who also put us into Egypt? And the answer seems to be building towards the idea that, well, going down to Egypt was necessary for our function as a people because it's like basic training where we learn the importance of not enslaving another nation. So that becomes a part of our mission as the Jewish people.
Yeah. In our collective memory, we need to remember that we were slaves in Egypt. We need to remember we were strangers in someone else's land and were mistreated. So when we become sovereign and become God's sovereign nation, we take that memory, and that's going to guide our day-to-day behavior. 15 times in the Torah, in key sections, the Torah says, be kind, don't oppress others. Remember, you were a stranger in someone else's land. When you're harvesting your field, remember to leave over for the poor. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt. When you have a slave and he goes free after 7 years, give him a bonus. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt. When you celebrate on the holidays, include the stranger, the orphan, the widow in your celebration. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt. Be kind to the stranger, love the stranger, because God loves the stranger. And that's how you serve Him. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt. Even in the Ten Commandments, the reason we keep Shabbat and Sefer Dvarim is to remember that our workers need a day of rest, so that you and your servants should rest, followed by remember you were a slave in Egypt and no one gave you a day of rest. So it's a central theme in Chumash, and it seems like in order to fulfill our goal as God's nation, God wants us to be extra sensitive and be this model nation who's always caring about the downtrodden and less fortunate. And our collective memory as a nation of our servitude and our suffering has to guide our day-to-day behavior. We call it post-traumatic growth. And therefore, that memory is not only important once a year. If it's about gratitude, once a year, say thank you. If that memory shapes our day-to-day behavior, I need to remember that event every day. In fact, our custom is to remember it every day and every night. In fact, that's Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah's comment in the Haggadah. He was one of the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, and he shares with us that discussion that he never understood why we have to mention every day and every night until his Rebbe told him, open up a Chumash in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 16, where it says, keep Passover, and then don't eat chametz when you bring the Passover sacrifice in the spring. Eat matzah for 7 days, lechem oni. And then it says, L'man tiskor yom tzeitcha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yimei chayecha. The purpose of our once-a-year celebration is its effect on our daily memory. The main mitzvah is the daily memory that shapes our behavior. So when we pledge allegiance to God every day, when we say the Shema, and we remember that God chose us to serve Him, first we mention we should do that service out of love. That's v'ahavta. We also mention reward and punishment, which also works as a good motivator to do things. And then the third parsha of Kriyat Shema, Parshat Tzitzit, ends with, I am the God who took you out of Egypt in order to be your God. I took you out of Egypt for a purpose. And that's the key point. We tell our children, if I follow Rashi and Ibn Ezra on Digat Levintcha, the main message is not explain to your children why you're eating matzah, but rather why God took you out of Egypt. Because we can understand that verse that I'm eating matzah to remember that God took me out of Egypt. That's gratitude, which is important. But Rashi claims, and that seems to be the simple reading of the verse, and Moshe will say that in Devarim, that we have to explain to our children, God took us out of Egypt in order to keep his mitzvot, like eating matzah and maror, and keeping his mitzvot. The main educational message is there's a purpose in our freedom. It's freedom for, not freedom from. So again, freedom from gratitude is important, but it's way more than that. And therefore, that theme of the Exodus that has to shape our behavior, identifying with suffering, at the end of the Seder, we say we have to feel like we went through the experience. But again, it's more than gratitude, it's about purpose and destiny. I think that's a message that's not taught enough. It's, again, gratitude is super important, and we thank God, we ask God for future redemption. But the purpose of why was it necessary to go through such suffering in someone else's land to become God's people, which is the opening covenant called Brit Ben Abtarim, which is how we begin our story at the Seder. That's a key point, which is a mega theme in the Torah. It's repeated by all the prophets. It's in Tehillim all the time. It's also in Sefer Dvarim, that theme that the reason why God took us out of Egypt was not just because we need to become free for the universal theme of freedom, but in order to serve God.
Right. So it's much broader than simply, you were slaves, so don't enslave others. It's you suffered, so help alleviate suffering. You were downtrodden, so care for the downtrodden. You were weak, so support the weak. Mm-hmm. And that comes up all over the place in Torah. And so that kind of explains much more deeply, like, why God put us in slavery in order to take us out. It kind of says it's not really a problem. If the point was freedom, then it would be a big problem that God put us in a state where we had no freedom, and that wouldn't really mean much that he also took us out of it. But the fact that he didn't that wasn't the point at all. The point was that we should experience suffering and then help others, so that with our understanding of what it feels like to suffer, so that we can then support others that are going through suffering.
And the Torah repeats in all the warnings in the Tochachot: if you don't serve God properly, if you don't act as God's Valo nation, I'll warn you. But if you don't get it right, I'll have to send you into exile. I'll make you suffer again to learn the hard way. So either we can learn the easy way by telling the story, identifying with that story, and acting accordingly. If we don't act accordingly, God threatens, you have to learn the hard way again.
Wow. So we've really got to learn the lesson from Pesach.
Yeah.
Remembering the story on Pesach could save us having to relive the story.
Yeah. It's interesting. As soon as Passover begins, God orchestrated the event that we came out in the spring. Mm-hmm. And in the spring, we begin our grain harvest. Now, in the land of Israel, the grain harvest is only 2 months a year. So during that grain harvest, remember, we count the weeks and the days, etc. But we wave this special offering called the Omer, which reminds us of the manna experience, which was related to the word Omer. And the end of that whole section of the 7 weeks, beginning with Chag HaMatzot in the spring, ending with Shavuot 7 weeks later with Chag HaKatzir, the end of our grain harvest. The last line is, when you're harvesting your field, leave over. Remember, leket, shichan, peah, leave over from your field for the poor and the needy, because we don't just say thank you, we act thank you. So God, we practice this message of taking that collective memory of our suffering and applying it in our day-to-day life, especially during our grain harvest. And that's why God took us out of Egypt in the Aviv in the spring, as we begin our grain harvest. Because if we want to be deserving of a good grain harvest, God tells us, the way to receive God's blessings in our grain harvest, which has to supply us for the entire year. Remember, we have 2 months of grain harvest, we have to eat that for 10 months. And maybe even for the next year, if there's a famine the next year. So therefore, our grain harvest is our staple. And Chumash's main message is, if you want to be worthy of a good grain harvest, it's not by feeding God and praising Him. It's by bringing a symbolic korban called the Omer, and maybe bringing a lamb or bringing whatever comes with the Shtei Alechem later on in Chumash. But the goal of that ritual is to remember that God is in charge of your grain harvest, But to be worthy of a good grain harvest, you have to use your grain harvest and manage your wealth and allocate to the needy what they need. You can't hoard everything for yourself, even though you have a need to. You always have to share with the others. That's what Megillat Ruth is all about. So that's taking the message of remembering you were a slave in Egypt and applying it in your day-to-day life.
Okay, can you just review for me that link between the Korban Omer and the manna in the desert that we ate?
So if you remember the story of the manna, it's the first time we have a Shabbat experience. We came out of Egypt. There's no food. We're in the desert. There's no food. We complain to God. God gives us lechem min hashamayim. And we're supposed to take as much as we need, not as much as we want every day. If you took too much, it didn't help you anyhow. It got wormy. And the utensil that we used to collect the manna was called the omer. The omer held a tenth of an ephah, but the word omer is associated with how we collect the manna. An omer for every person. Again, what exactly an omer is, that's an argument. But the word omer is a special word the Chumash uses, which begins with the story of the manna. And in the story of the manna, we have what's called wealth management, or how to allocate your assets. Why? Is you take every day as much as you need, because you take as much as you need, then there'll be enough for others. On Friday, you can take double, because taking double on Friday is as much as you need, because it won't fall on Shabbat. So when is it okay to take more than you need? When you need for the next day. Now, that's a very simple model because it's, 1 day a week, I have to take double. But if I apply that to our agriculture in the land of Israel, I can't take as much as I need during my 7 weeks of grain harvest because I need that grain harvest for the entire year. So by the very nature of agriculture in Israel, I need to hoard my grain when I'm harvesting because I have to harvest for an entire year during those 2 months. And that's critical. If that grain harvest is bad, we're finished. Remember, our ancestors went down to Egypt when there was a famine in the land. And not everyone could go down to Egypt. A family can, but not the entire nation. And therefore, who's going to live and who's going to die is highly dependent on that grain harvest. Now, the Canaanites knew that, and they prayed to the fertility god, to the grain god, to the rain god, to all the gods of nature. Chumash tells us there's one God in charge of all those powers of nature, who he's in charge of the grain and the rain and our fertility, etc., and the plenty of the land. But it's a function of our deeds. We say every day in the Shema. And therefore, the name of the wave offering that we bring at the beginning of our grain harvest with that barley, we call it Omer. And we count for the next 7 weeks, which coincides with our grain harvest. We talk about Omer. And then at the end, we bring what's called the symbolic double loaves of bread, Shtei Alechem, with a special offering. And the last line is, remember when you're harvesting your field, to take care of the poor and the needy. Leave over. Remember? Leket, Shicha, and Peah. And therefore, what's beautiful about it, ancient man thought, if I feed a God, he'll give me grain. Okay? God tells us, give a symbolic offering to God to remember that you need to feed the poor for God to bless your fields. And that's a totally flipped classroom of, that's a total difference in our service of God and idol worship. Idol worship is consumerism. It's God's working for us. In Judaism, we work on behalf of God. The way that God takes care of the needy by giving us the ability to take care of the needy. So we need to amass wealth. We need to build up our capital. But how we allocate our capital and how we share that with the needy, that is very basic in our national behavior and our individual behavior also as a nation. And that's how we sanctify God, by acting as that nation. Our experience of our suffering in Egypt and our experiences in the desert were there to train us to how we have to act once we have sovereignty and we have our own land. So again, it's not about saying thank you for our freedom and saying thank you for our land and for our prosperity, but acting thank you and using that prosperity in the service of God.
So we need to apply the message of Pesach of we were vulnerable and poor and destitute in Egypt, and then we need to turn that immediately into action by starting to count the Omer, bring the Korban Omer, and remember how we were vulnerable also in the desert, and we needed to take what we needed and not too much, in order that we remember that when we are actually harvesting our grain in Israel, that we take what we need, not too much, and share with the poor.
Yeah. And listen how we begin our Seder with halach ma'anya, remember?
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's three ways to translate lach ma'anya. Some people say it's poor man's bread. Some people it's the bread of our affliction. The rabbis say it's conversation bread. Now, the word ani, ayin, nun, yud, or ayin, nun, can mean poor, ani. Oni means affliction. And la'anot, to answer, is also the same letters. And therefore, the rabbis say, what we do is we begin a conversation. I call yachatz, when we break the matzah, an icebreaker, to start a conversation. Right. We use poor man's bread, right, to start a conversation that reminds us of our affliction and a lesson we learn from our affliction. So in a beautiful way, that's why Chumash calls this bread lechem oni in Sefer Dvarim, together with the message, and again in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 3, is when you bring the Pesach, no chametz, eat matzah for 7 days, lechem oni, in order to remember the day you left Egypt every day of your life. Which is what Rabbi Eliezer makes a big deal about in the beginning of he was one of those rabbis in Bnei Brak, that was a conversation we share. He was the rabbi hitting 70, never understood why every day and every night, until his Rebbe said, read Chumash. Now, that's a key message of the Seder, but it's beautiful how the word for matzah, lechem oni, reflects that same idea. That I take as symbolic ritual of being poor and being needy and being afflicted, and to start a conversation of what I learned from that affliction, how I apply that to my day-to-day life. And that becomes central to our Judaism.
Right. So it's almost like a cycle. We take the three meanings of lechem oni, or lachma anya: poor man's bread, affliction bread, answering bread, or conversation bread. It is poor man's bread. Why are we eating it? Because we were afflicted, and we have to talk about that in order to come back to this affliction and say, we're actually going to fight against affliction, going to fight.
And our conversation begins about a better future, not harping on the past, but building this year in slavery, next year we'll be free. This year outside land of Israel, next year in the land of Israel. There's the conversation of the first Seder. Remember the first time we ate matzah was back in Egypt. That's what our ancestors ate. And when they sat down to the first Seder, they talked about a better future.
Interesting. So halach ma'anya is doing the same thing that the Jewish people in Egypt did that very first.
And the first thing, our first commandment was to form a group and invite others. Remember? Every family has to have a lamb, not enough people, invite your neighbors. Have a large meal, have a conversation. Have anti-Egyptian bread called matzah. Eat maror to remember your suffering. Take this Egyptian god.
How is matzah anti-Egyptian?
Because in ancient Egypt, chametz, check it in Wikipedia, Egypt invented beer. They invented sourdough. The whole idea of fermentation, the art of making bread. I think there was a minister in the Egyptian government in charge of baking. Remember he had a dream?
Oh, right. Yeah.
And he had such a good ending. That whole idea that Egypt was known for its bread and for its leaven. So to be worthy of going out of Egypt, we have to reject our Egyptian culture. We have to, chametz will symbolize, in the beginning, it was the evil Egyptian culture that afflicted and enslaved other people. Later, in Jewish thought, chametz becomes a symbol of anything that's wrong or evil or bad. And to be worthy of redemption, to be worthy of becoming God's people, not just to say thank you, but to act thank you, we need to get rid of, symbolically, of our chametz, getting rid of our bad ways. Therefore, all the laws of chametz are the same as idol worship. You can't own it, you can't see it. We take, now, in the physical world, simplicity, flour and water, simple bread. Chametz is making it fancy. Now, there's room for becoming fancy, but in the very beginning stage, keep it simple. Remember, it's about humility, simplicity, and again, it's the start, it's the spring. We're going to start our year back to basics. Now, there's room for growth and wealth, and I can bring shtei alechem 7 weeks later when I receive the Torah. But it begins with starting with your basics. And therefore, again, like when you have a meal to remember historical events, you need to remember why they happened. And therefore, what we eat at the Seder, we have to explain that. That's what Rabbi Gamliel in the Mishnah says. That's how we end our Seder, the end Magid. that if you don't explain why I'm eating matzah and maror, I didn't fulfill my obligation of telling the story. When we do ritual, we have to understand the meaning of that ritual and how it affects our lives. And then we say every generation has to feel as though they went through that experience. So all those things, they're in the Seder, but if you don't realize what verses we're quoting and where they're coming from, you can't appreciate how deep the message is.
So you're saying, when Rabbi Gamliel says anybody who hasn't mentioned Pesach, Matzah, and Maror on Seder night, they haven't fulfilled their obligation, you don't think that it just means saying Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, but why we have Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. And the answer to that is essentially, we were afflicted so that we ensure that we fight against affliction.
Yeah. Because when you keep a ritual, you have to understand why you're doing it. It's called Tamei Mitzvot. So what I was saying is, there's if you want to fulfill your obligation of telling the story and its meaning, you have to connect the story you're telling to the commandments you're keeping. And remember, Matzah Zu Hashuma, remember we were rushed out and we have time. It reminds us of how God took us out of Egypt and how we were afflicted and how we have to take that story and learn our lesson and apply it in our day-to-day life.
I've always wondered about that line because, we ate matzah because matzah didn't have time to rise. I wonder if it ties into this broader theme that you're talking about, because God did tell us to make matzah already beforehand.
No.
So
now you get into a complicated topic because there's two different reasons for matzah. There's matzah that we eat at the Seder that we were commanded 2 weeks before we left Egypt in Parashat HaChodesh on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which is basically anti-Egyptian bread. Because we're going to take an Egyptian god for our main course and eat moror to remember our affliction. And we're going to eat, simple bread, not Egyptian bread, because we're leaving Egypt. It's the cute way of saying is that first God has to take us out of Egypt, or Moshe's job is to first take the Jews out of Egypt and then take Egypt out of the Jews. That's how to change your culture and become a culture dedicated to God. Now, that's the first reason for matzah, and that's why the main mitzvah is getting rid of your chametz, which symbolizes Egyptian culture, more than eating matzah. Remember, the Torah says 7 times, I think, you have to eat matzah for 7 days. The rabbis say, no, it's enough to eat it the first night. But the main mitzvah is getting rid of your chametz. You can't own it, you can't see it. If you keep chametz, you're cut off from the covenant. Chumash puts more of an accent. It highlights more the prohibition of chametz is more important than eating the matzah. Because to be worthy of redemption, you have to get rid of your bad behavior.
I see. So when we say that we're eating matzah for 7 days, and that initial commandment to have matzah, that was because it was matzah as opposed to chametz, because chametz was Egyptian, and matzah is therefore anti-Egyptian. So we need to reject
and simplicity. Again, the whole theme of living as much to be. It's important to have wealth and build capital, etc. But how you manage that, what you do with your wealth, which is a big theme. Read the Devarim chapter 8 with v'chata v'sabata berachta. But don't let your wealth stay to kol chivot tzibiyadi. That don't let your prosperity lead to haughtiness and affluence, but use it to do mitzvot.
Right.
Again, these are all mega themes all through Chumash, and the whole story begins our history. We're supposed to learn from our history.
And how does the second reason for eating matzah tie into it?
Now, on top of that, it turns out that we were rushed out of Egypt. We left Egypt because Egypt kicked us out. As we convinced Egypt it's in their interest, we have to serve our God. And our first redemption we weren't ready for. And when we say, remember, we baked the matzah when we left Egypt. We were planning to bake bread the morning. Remember, we had all that dough. We didn't have time to bake our dough in Egypt because the Egyptians kicked us out. Remember, they said, go serve your God. Get out of here as soon as you can. Go serve your God to stop these plagues. And we were rushed out of Egypt, not even ready for redemption yet. And we need to remember that experience that God put us through, that last minute, that chipazon, that quickness, get out of here real quick. All of a sudden, you leave your house, you're gone, and your whole life changes overnight. And that's how our redemption began. We need to remember God's involvement in our history and how sudden it was, how quick it was. And again, eating matzah is going to remind us of the whole story of the Exodus. Now, what's the meaning? Why we had to be rushed out by the Egyptians? And that's a whole long story when you study Sefer Shemot. But it was definitely this amazing experience that you couldn't forget.
Why weren't the Jewish people ready to go? Why did they not plan the time they needed to bake their bread? Like, didn't they know? Like, they were told to eat with their shoes on and their belts on and their walking staffs ready
They
to
were
go.
also told, don't leave your house until the morning. Don't leave your house all night long because it's dangerous at night. And all of a sudden, at midnight, Pharaoh says, get out of here. They're caught by surprise. They know they were leaving, didn't know they were leaving so quick.
So they were expecting to like be ready to go at first light, but actually they left at midnight. They started
starting from midnight. Some things say at night, sometimes early in the morning, but it was definitely towards the end of the night, the beginning of the morning. It was way quicker than we thought. That was the idea of chipazon. Because we're caught by surprise, and it's an experience that sort of wakes you up. And now, why we aren't ready for redemption makes a lot of sense. We're in slavery for hundreds of years. Our culture was basically Egyptian. Yechezkel chapter 20 talks about it. God was hoping that we turn over a new leaf even sooner, but when we get out of Egypt, we're ready to get out of Egypt. We're not ready to get to Torah yet. We have to go through the Mara experience. We have to go through the Mana experience. We have to have a war with Amalek. We need miraculous water. It's going to take 7 weeks from the time we leave Egypt till we get to Torah at Har Sinai. But God has to put us through all these experiences to build our faith in God. But we have to go through experience to show our dependence on God as well. We need God for water. We need God for food. That's part of the, I call it Sana University. Now, it's excusable why the first generation wasn't ready for redemption, but we need to remember that redemption requires readiness and preparation. But redemption is a purpose. The goal is not freedom, it's freedom for, not just freedom from.
Right. I like that. Redemption requires readiness. We need to remember we weren't ready to remember that we need to be ready for the next redemption.
Now, that generation had a good excuse. Remember?
Right.
But remember, after the first failures, they were giving up hope. Remember, they doubled the workload. They were pretty upset with Moshe. And all through in the first couple of years, the first couple of months, weeks in the desert, they want to go back. Remember, they say, why'd you bring us out here to die? And aren't there enough graves in Egypt? And if you want us all dead, kill us on a full stomach in Egypt, not on an empty stomach in the desert. They have an attitude problem, which is understandable. But when we remember that God put us through that difficult experience to learn from. So they have an excuse, maybe, but our generation can learn from that, and because we don't have the same excuse they had. And remember, we say, God can redeem us again, but on the condition we're worthy.
Fascinating. All right. So,
speaking of redemption, we have to pray for our own redemption. Things happen really fast overnight. Things change. People have to, unfortunately, many families in Israel, all of a sudden overnight, bomb explodes. They have to move their house, rebuild their homes, move to a hotel. I mean, we have these little Exodus stories of our own. We're living through times with great superpowers involved. But we don't know what. We just pray to God it's going to go in the right direction. But we know God can help us. But understand we have to be worthy of His help and how we act with one another, how we act as a Jewish people, how we treat one another. The society that we build, that's necessary to make us worthy for redemption to continue.
Thank you so much. Wow. So powerful. Rabbi Liebtag, I asked you to give me something that we missed, and honestly, I feel like I'm looking at the HaGadol completely differently now. Thank you so much. And as you say, Sheniyeh Re'uyim, may we be worthy of, as we redeem them, may we be worthy.
We know God can redeem, will He? It's a two-way street.
That's it. All right. Thank you so much. Wishing everybody a Chag Sameach, and may we all be able to remember our redemption and experience redemption once again. Thank you very much.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.